Yeah,
be good to find out.
Yeah.
Right. So we're transitioning into the kind of workshop bit of this morning's session. The way we're going to organise this is that you'll get 3 very quick primers, which will mostly be reminding you of what Nikki has already told you, but it's just to get us really into the mindset for some real work that we're all going to do. So we've got 3 short introductions from myself, Russell and Sarah, and then we're going to break out into 3 groups, and we'll all do some work, and then we're going to need a rapporteur from each of those groups, preferably someone who wasn't in Cape Town, to come back at the end and report back on their thoughts. Can I increase the height of this microphone? Because otherwise no one's going to hear me. And I'm stooping a lot.
The other one works as well.
Oh, is it? Okay. So maybe I can get away without it. Can everybody hear me? Excellent. Right, so I'm going to kick this off by telling you a rather personal view of our competency journey within the ISCB. And then I think I'll go back to that. Okay. Actually, just before I do that, I'll just say a few words about the 3 breakout groups that we're going to have. We've devised some specific questions that we want you to answer in the breakout groups. So the first group will have a look at the competency framework and the guidelines. The second group will think about the process for endorsement of courses, and the third group will think about trainer support. And all of these questions have been made available to you in the agenda. Now, I circulated the agenda via the ISCB committee mailing list, the ISCB COSI mailing list, and the ISCB COSI Google group, which I believe is the biggest of those lists. If you're not on any of those lists, put your hand up. Oh, goodness, okay. So there is also a tiny URL that will give you a link to the document, and that is tiny.cc.all-lowercase-ISCBWEB. I really, really wish I had a flip chart to write that down on, but I don't. If not, find someone who's in the... Oh, I could type on the slides, couldn't I? Yes. I do this. So, hang on. Tiny.cc. I think this is right because I'm remembering this and my memory's not the best. That's 60 point or something. Okay. And that's a lowercase t. That's second dot's a slash. That one's a slash. I knew I'd got something wrong. Okay. Yeah. That's got you there, right? Excellent. We got there in the end. Okay. Right. So really I just want to take you on a whistle-stop tour of what has been only 6 or 7 years' work within the ISCB. But it's been rather discontinuous work, I have to say, because we've not had summit meetings until this year. So I really just want to make sure that we all have a shared understanding of what competency is, re-familiarise you or familiarise you if you haven't seen it before with the competency framework and our reasons for creating it, and just quickly remind you of the outputs that are relevant to the competency piece of what we're doing today. So this is my working definition of competency: an observable ability of any professional that integrates multiple components such as knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes. So we could just roll these into KSAs and use KSAs as an all-encompassing term for this. Jessica's already introduced this very nicely in a way. One of the great things about this is that its acquisition can be validated objectively. And we like them because, in just the same way as the performance level descriptors that she showed us, competency requirements are a shared currency that can be applicable to learning of all types and at all career stages. So you can use them throughout your career to develop yourself. The way we've gone about this is to put those competency requirements for various types of bioinformatics professional into a framework or a profile. And I actually think its structure is remarkably similar to that of the mastery rubric. The psychology behind it might be slightly different, but the structure is mappable. And so that framework defines the competencies required to fulfill a particular role. And these things, I mean, there are lots of them around covering lots and lots of different professions. But typically they're defined by professional bodies or learned societies in collaboration with employers. And so that's why I said I think the competency framework kind of comes more from the employer's stance and can I hire and develop someone who's going to be useful to me in this role and who I'm going to be able to develop further. So why does the ISCB care about it? Well, because we are the Learned Society for Computational Biology. And so this is a community that can work actively on creating a meaningful framework for that community of professionals to develop and to stay up to date with what, as we all acknowledge, is a very, very rapidly developing field. So really this all started back in the late 90s with Ross Altman, who articulated the need for a bioinformatics curriculum. At the time, there were lots and lots of graduate level courses popping up. And bioinformatics was a very, very young field. And so everybody was putting their own spin on it. And they might have their own, one or two experts in quite specialised areas of bioinformatics. And they were all setting up their own curricula. And none of them were comparable. And nobody really had any grasp of what should we be putting in these curricula. The answer was, well, we're going to put in what I know and what I can teach, and that was unique to every course, but not necessarily useful to employers. So fast forward now to 2011, and the Education Committee had formed by this point, and decided to do a survey around what should be in such a curriculum. And this is before my time, so if there's anybody in the room who was around in 2011, then please do correct me. But my understanding is that the idea behind that survey was we might start to build a pilot curriculum. And then the committee hit a bottleneck. And the bottleneck was, well, how do you compare existing curricula given the scant amount of information that you can find online? So what is in a module entitled Bioinformatics 101? Nobody knew, and it was very difficult to find out. So they kind of came up against a bit of a bottleneck there. And this is when, in a BOF session, I think in about 2012 or 2013, we started to think about, shall we capture what trainees need to get out of a course rather than what trainers think they ought to put into it with no prior knowledge of what those needs are? And so at this point, a kind of subgroup from the committee started working on thinking about it in those terms and putting version 1 of the competency framework together. And the real purpose of this is that there are lots of different routes to the same destination. And it doesn't really matter how you get there. You can get there via many, many different routes. The important thing is that you achieve that competency. And hopefully you achieve it in a reasonable time frame. And so that version 1 of the competency framework had, I think, 16 different broad areas of competency. And I actually think they map onto the mastery rubric rather well. Biology's in the first 2, and then we sort of start to get into the more computational things. And I think they're well and truly mappable, if that was something that we wanted to do. The other dimension that we put into this thinking was that there are many different types of bioinformatician or bioinformatics professional, because most of them don't actually self-identify as bioinformatician. And at the time, we broke it up into these 3 broad groups, which we've already heard a lot about this morning: the user, the scientist, and the engineer. And then we hit a bit of a second bottleneck, because, to be perfectly honest with you, even the people who'd been working on this were not... We all had a different idea of what a user was, for sure. And many of us had a different idea of where the boundary between a scientist and an engineer was. And so we began thinking, well, we sort of know what these terms mean, but they don't make the framework very usable. And so at that point we thought, well, why don't we put in some examples of real roles that conform to these different personas? And so that's where we came up. And these are just examples. It's definitely not an exhaustive list of some people who might fit into the user category, some people who might fit into the scientist category, and some people who might fit into the engineer category. And I suppose when you're starting to think about what your target audience is, you might start to think, well, have I got physicians coming to my course? Have I got, sort of classical molecular life scientist researcher coming to my course? Or have I got somewhere whose real thing is software engineering? That's kind of how I would make those distinctions. We also acknowledged that learning is a journey, and so this is where we sort of start to come into the rubric thinking again. And so you might not expect someone at graduate level to have the same level of competency as someone who's been in a role for 5 years. You would hope that they would develop professional skills that someone who's straight out of university wouldn't have. And so we started to think about, well, what area of sophistication do you need in each of the competency areas to fulfill the roles that we've defined? And at that point, we published version 2. And this was incredibly difficult, actually, because in many cases we couldn't say, somebody in this role needs, to be at, level 5 in the Bloom's taxonomy, and they always need to be at level 5. So we made sure that several people thought about each of these boxes, and we came to a consensus, but it was quite challenging to come to that consensus. And so that paper was published, I think this is the one that Nikki and Russell were first authors on this paper, and that was published at the beginning of last year, I think, or was it the beginning of 2017? And then I think we really were moving in the same direction as the mastery rubric group, but we came to it again from a slightly different direction. At the EBI, we've been working on a number of different competency frameworks in different contexts, and one of the things that we found useful in all those other contexts was putting knowledge, skills, and attitudes or behaviours appropriate for each of the competency areas that we defined down on paper, because people recognise the KSAs in a way that they don't necessarily identify with the competency statements themselves. You can because they focus on measurable things. An individual can say, yes, I have that behaviour, or yes, I have that knowledge in my brain, or yes, that's a skill that I have, I want to develop it further, but that's a skill that I have. And so at the summit meeting, we decided to look at the competency framework at a meta level, decide whether it was still up to date. Do we need to add some? Do we need to lose some? Do we need to merge some? But then the bulk of the work that we did was adding the KSAs to each of these competency areas. So just to show you a very kind of high level view of the changes that we made to the framework, and I'm sorry this is a little bit difficult to read, but I'll make all of these slides available. I'll stick them in a Google folder somewhere where they're available to everyone on the web. So the first, the first 4 stayed the same. We split the statistical research methods competency into 2 because we didn't think data management was well represented, and we felt that it needed to be. So we now have, we've expanded the statistical one to include machine learning, data science, and you know, the things that there have been so many talks about at this meeting. And then we've added a new one on data management. We made some amendments to the F&G, bioinformatics tools and their usage, added resources in there, made it broader, and tweaked G. This was quite a complicated one. We decided that we needed something on the fundamentals of computer science systems. We needed something on the fundamentals of computer science theory. And then also, increasingly, we need to have something on human-computer interaction and building usable software, usable resources, usable tools. So there was a lot of tinkering with competencies that were already there to bring them up to date and make them more representative of employers' needs here. L we deprecated because we felt that we could fit it into I think it was M actually. So we've got rid of one, and then again we tweaked M a little bit to make sure that it basically covered all aspects of the LC issues around computational biology, and was appropriate for those in clinical decision-making situations, for example, where they're dealing with real patient data. And then N, O, and P stayed exactly the same as they were in version 2. So there was a lot of thought that went into what we changed at the meta level, but then considerably more work went into defining the KSAs for each of those new competency areas. And we haven't, I mean, I would not consider that we can give this a green tick yet. I would say this is still in the amber zone, because the granularity of these, if you run through the entire framework, is quite varied. What we'd like to get down to is, you know, maybe four or five KSAs associated with each competency, and in some cases we've got a lot more. The reason for having a lot more is that we've also made an attempt to map to other frameworks, and so where, for example, Engineers Australia had already done a good job on some of the software engineering and human-computer interactions one, we borrowed heavily from them. We borrowed heavily from other frameworks, and so we've got this huge long list that now needs to be consolidated. So there's still some work there, and we'd really like to have some more volunteers to help us with that work. Thinking about what Jessica presented earlier, I think the way I see these being used is to then stage them, because a graduate bioinformatician is not going to need every one of these. So we could start to think about how we fit it into the stages of the mastery rubric. So this is kind of where we are now. and where we want to be is that we've got happy course providers delivering quality training to happy learners who make competent employees who do or enable groundbreaking research with positive impact on society. So that's the goal that we're aiming for, and we're kind of getting close, actually. And of course, then we have to enable people to use the competency framework. And I won't go through this in any detail because Nikki has already put it up, but we've put together a guidelines document that articulates how to use the framework in a number of contexts. And that spans, you know, starting a course from scratch, starting an entire program from scratch, looking at a course or a program that you already have and thinking about how it maps to the competency framework and where your gaps are, and also remapping a course that's been mapped to a previous version of the framework, because we've got a number of trailblazers in the room who've already mapped to versions 1 and 2, and we're now going to ask them to do a bit of work to map to version 3. And so having some guidelines on how you do that readily, will be a useful thing. So I'm going to stop there. I can answer maybe 1 or 2 questions around, you know, if anybody wants clarification on anything. And then I think we should move on to Russell's talk. Celia, could you use the microphone, please? Sorry.
Only one small question, actually. First of all, I'm happy that you added data management.
Yeah.
Might maybe revert to data
and of
data
course, we want
stewardship.
to map to the work that you presented yesterday.
But my question was, when you started filling the table with the KSAs, did you also already discuss the level of the bloom for the specific KSA, or was that not in the process yet?
So many of the KSAs use Bloom's terms, and so that can guide us. If we were to go back to version 2, then we've got the Bloom's levels for each of those different professions. The way I would see this going is that we think about what KSAs are needed at different stages, and we then think about what's appropriate for these different professions. So I would like to do the staging of the KSAs first, I think, and then go back to the different professions and essentially do an exclusion exercise at that point, get a group of people who are in that profession together, some of whom are trailblazers in the bioinformatics aspects of that role, and define what they can chuck out for their role. Because not all of it is going to be relevant to every person in every role at every stage.
No, that's clear. Okay, yeah, thanks.
Okay, well, if there are no more points of clarification, could I ask Russell to come to the front? And Russell's going to talk to us about